everyone. The last topic for the day is nothing other than compensation study. And I want to be able to conclude today's work session by 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, keep that in mind. With that, Dr. Garza, you want to have a first comment?
Yes, because I know this is a very important topic, and I know it's getting late, and Mr. Moon gave us a hard stop time. I just want to point out that we've had already at least one work session on compensation, maybe more. We have also this work scheduled for every work session, I think, for the remainder of the spring. So March's all-day work session, we'll talk about this some more. April, May, June. So this is not the last time that you'll have a chance to visit and talk more about this. So I don't want you to feel like there's any pressure tonight to examine all of it and answer every question you have, because this is important information, and so we want to make sure that we've had plenty of time to talk about it. But I know this is probably, we're not our freshest at this time, but just want to remind you that we will, at the end of this presentation, you'll be getting, if you noted, there's some key questions at the end for you to think about for the next work session. And certainly, if you have questions even beyond tonight, you could email them to us, and we can certainly follow up. I just want to say, as we start this presentation, we're so happy to have Dr. Ramey here with us. You've been here now for a month, something like that. And I've already gotten such nice comments from the field, from our principals and from others, people in HR, that he's already made such a positive, has had already a positive impact on the work that's going on, very important work that's going on in HR. So we're really glad to have you, Chase, in our system, and I'm gonna let you tee up and introduce Heather, okay?
Thank you to the board for letting us engage with you this evening around this topic. As Dr. Garza said, this will be a continuation of an ongoing conversation, and so I won't belabor it any more than that. But this is Heather Kazemi. I know that she was with you in the fall to present part of our first part of the market study related to teachers. And tonight's presentation will focus more on some of our other employee groups. And we'll do a quick recap of the teacher information, then go into those other groups. And with that, I'll turn it over to Heather.
There we go. Thank you. Given the late hour, I am going to go a little bit faster than I had planned. So if I'm talking too fast, please raise your hand and stop me and tell me to slow down, because I have a lot of information to share and I want to make sure we get to the end. So as Dr. Ramey said, today I'm going to share with you the second half of the market study results, which covers findings for instructional assistants, school administrators, and other staff. First, I'll restate the background and methodology we used to conduct the market study. Then I'll share the findings of each group, recapping teachers, then talking about instructional assistants, then school administrators, and then the other unified scale jobs. After the study findings, I'll talk a little bit about the next steps in the process for the compensation study overall. And so the next slide reiterates the purpose of the study. As you know, the board has established a strategic goal to have a premier workforce and to recruit and retain high-quality employees who are valued, respected, and rewarded for their efforts. This market study contributes to that goal by quantifying our market position for base salaries and total compensation. Again, base salaries as well as total compensation, which includes the cost of benefits. In the next phase of the study, once we understand our market position and what our employees value and how others value and reward their employees, we'll then develop a new compensation model that is designed to recruit and retain the qualified and skilled teachers and staff needed to support the current and future needs of the school community. The next slide shows some information on the study methodology. Again, this is the same information I shared with you all in December, but I just thought we should repeat a little bit of it just to refresh your memory. The market study covers employees on all three salary scales. Currently, we have three salary scales, one for teachers, one for instructional assistants, and a third one called the Unified Scale, which covers all other employees, including school administrators. The study measures total compensation costs, including base pay ranges, health benefit costs, and retirement benefit costs. I wanted to pause here for a minute and talk a little bit about the concept of base pay ranges. We all think we know what pay is, and this is direct compensation, what employees receive in their paycheck. But for this study, what we've looked at are the base pay ranges. And what I mean by that is on those 3 salary scales that I talked about, every job is in a pay range with a minimum and a maximum rate. That is to say, the school system doesn't pay anyone lower than the minimum for that particular job or any higher than the maximum for that particular job. So these dollar amounts are not necessarily what every employee is currently being paid. It's simply the scheduled range. So even if there's not a single employee in that title right now, that's still the pay range, the minimum and the maximum scheduled range. That's what we're comparing to other school systems and other employers as well.
And the reason this is important is because we can't show you analysis on these other positions in a similar way as we did our teachers. So that's why the methodology is going to look very different tonight, what you see. We actually have a pay schedule for teachers that has steps. We don't have the same kind of scales for other positions throughout this division. So that's why you'll see it a different way tonight. Okay, and to summarize that point, I'm gonna move us along a little bit more, Heather. You don't have to necessarily read the slides. Maybe just touch on some high points.
Okay.
And that is I've lost my train of thought now. To reiterate, this is reflective of scales and not necessarily what compensation is for any one employee. And that's an important distinction. It's our scales, not what we're currently paying any person. For an example, when you see some of these, we may not be paying a single person the maximum of the scale. We may not be paying a single person the minimum, the lowest end of the scale. It is our current scales and what people see when they determine if they're going to apply an FCPS.
Right. And the way I like to think about this is imagine it's the first day of Fairfax County Public Schools. You haven't hired anybody yet, but you've decided that this is the pay scale and that this job is going to be on a certain grade on that pay scale. We're trying to evaluate now whether that grade is market competitive and will you be able to attract and keep the kind of employees you want. So it's sort of a different way to think about it. So moving on to the 3 market segments, we surveyed 7 school districts, the same school districts that we talked about for the teacher salary comparison. In addition, we also looked at 5 local governments in the area, and we also looked at the private sector. As you may know, private sector employers do not respond to individual surveys, particularly from public entities where that information would be made public. They have no incentive to answer that sort of survey. So we use published data, and there's lots of published data in the metro area, and we use that to represent the private sector market. It's important to note that not all of these organizations that we've surveyed have matches to all of the jobs that we were looking at. In this half of the study, we're looking at over 100 job titles. So whereas with teachers, we knew that all 7 school districts, of course, hire teachers. It made it a fairly straightforward type of analysis. Here we're dealing with a lot of different job titles. So some of the school districts might have a matching job to the ones we're looking at, and some might not. So what the end result of that is sometimes there's more data points for a particular job than there are for others. An example, administrative assistant is a job that is in nearly every organization. We could find some very good and clear job matches with almost everyone we surveyed. Paralegal, still a fairly known job and is out there, is in a lot of organizations. But one of the job titles we looked at is also demographer. That's a little more rare. And not everyone that we surveyed is going to have a similar kind of job. So I just want to give you some examples of how this works. The next slide talks a bit about the efforts we made to ensure that we do have appropriate job matches. As I said, we sent a survey a customized survey document out to each of the employers where we were asking them for information. They read job summaries that we provided to them to describe that job, including their responsibilities and minimum requirements. And they told us what they thought would be the closest match in their organization. We then spent a lot of time, many weeks over the past few months, validating those job matches by looking at organization charts, by reading job descriptions that were provided to us, by looking at job classification listings, budget documents, a lot of other information to make sure that we had the best possible job matches. Even though we did that, it's important to understand that very rarely is there such a thing as an exact job match. Jobs are slightly different from organization to organization. The different, particularly the school systems we were looking at, some of them are quite a bit smaller than Fairfax, so we really needed to determine what would be the best possible match, knowing that there's very rarely an exact, very rarely the exact same position from one organization to the next. So let's talk a little bit about the findings. First, a recap of what I shared with you in December on teachers, just to have a baseline, refresh your memory. This chart is very similar to the one I shared with you in December. It shows the career earnings of a teacher who starts with a bachelor's degree and works towards their master's degree over several years. It shows a 30-year career. The green line in the middle is the market average. That's a survey average of all the 7 school districts that we looked at. The dotted red line below that green line is Fairfax County Public Schools, and then the line on the top, I don't know what color it looks like here, sort of orange, that one is Arlington Public Schools. So what I shared with you in December was that the 30-year market gap for a teacher here is $142,000 over that 30-year career compared to the market average. But when we compare it to Arlington, we're talking about $293,000. And again, that's cumulative over a 30-year career.
Heather, in the interest of time, because I do think it's important for you all to have this in this report, the teacher compensation comparisons, because that way you have it all in one place. So I do think it's important that you included it in this,
Okay.
but in the interest of time, unless any board member has questions over that part, we might want to just go on to the other positions, if that's okay.
And we've also posted the December 7th work session presentation
Have it in one
in the
place?
same
Okay.
board docs presentation for today.
Okay. So let's move on. Instructional assistants. FCPS has 3 classification titles for about 3,000 employees or positions that assist teachers in the classroom. These 3 titles are instructional assistant, that's the largest group. Instructional assistants are paraprofessional roles that provide instructional, clerical, and support work for teachers. These positions typically require an associate's degree or the equivalent to be considered highly qualified. Public health training assistants is the second job title, and employees in those positions also provide some instructional assistance, but are also there to help with special education needs of children. And public health attendants is the third job title, and while those also assist in special education classrooms, they're more focused on the daily care and physical care of students. So I just wanted to give you that background as we look at the findings for these 3 jobs. I should say the instructional assistants are on their own salary scale, and the other 2 job titles are on the unified scale. The reason why we're showing them all together here is because we found that other school systems pay them on the same scales and generally see them as a job hierarchy, so it made sense to group them. Here yet? Okay. So let me explain this chart to you. This chart shows those scheduled pay ranges that I was talking about. On the left side, you'll see two lines, one for the instructional assistants here at FCPS, and that starts with, it's a 10-month position, and the minimum salary is $20,743, and the maximum is $43,582. The line next to that is the survey average for comparable jobs. And you see the starting rate, or the minimum rate, is a little bit higher in the market average than it is at FCPS, but the maximum is a little bit lower. For the public health training assistant, those are the two lines in the middle of the chart. You see that the minimum rate and the maximum rate at FCPS is a little bit higher than the survey average. And again, I want to stress this is the average of the employers that we looked at. Public health attendants, on the other hand, the salary range is a little bit lower here than in the survey average. Now, I know I went pretty fast with that. I had a lot more notes, but I hope that's clear. All right. So this next chart is a bar chart that shows total compensation. And I should say this is how I'm going to share the results for all of the employee groups, starting with those lines for the base salaries and then moving on to bar charts showing the total compensation. And here we've looked at the midpoint of that pay range. So before we were looking at minimum and maximum, we needed one number to add all of the total compensation to, and we chose the middle of the pay range. And this includes the costs for health benefits, the contributions to the retirement plans, to calculate a total compensation. So when the costs of salaries and benefits are combined, we see here that these total compensation costs are generally market comparable for these three positions. Okay. Okay to move on, Dr. Garza? Okay. Next, let's talk about school administrators. We currently have about 659 school administrator positions, which are covered by 4 classification titles in this study. Director of Student Services, Director of Student Activities, Assistant Principals, and of course, School Principals. All of these positions are currently paid on the unified scale. So we looked at these salary ranges using the same method, the same approach as we did for all of the others, or for the instructional assistants. This slide shows those director positions, the Director of Student Services and the Director of Student Activities. So what we can conclude from this chart is that the minimum rates, those starting rates for these positions, are below the market average, more so for the 2 high school positions. Director of Student Services at high school and Director of Student Activities in high school, those starting rates are notably below the survey average.
And the reason you zeroed in on high school on these positions is because a lot of our schools that we compared ourselves to did not have a comparable position at the middle school level. Is that correct?
Correct, correct. The next slide shows the assistant principals, and it's worth noting here that at FCPS, assistant principals work 11 months, so what's reflected here is an 11-month salary. Most of the school systems that we survey, that we looked at, have a 12-month schedule for their assistant principals. So the numbers you see here have been adjusted down to an 11-month schedule. So we wanted to compare 11 months to 11 months. So what we see here is, again, the starting rates or the minimum rates for assistant principals are significantly below the market average, in some cases about $20,000 a year below the market average. The maximum rates are also below market, but not quite as notably. Still below.
So on this one specifically, we may be paying very few people at the minimum or the lowest, so we could just compress our range and it gets us more competitive automatically. So that's something to think about as we move forward, because at the higher end, we're much closer. Is that correct, Heather?
That's correct.
But our range is much broader as well.
Right. And this last chart shows the school principals for elementary school, middle school, and high school. And similar to the findings for the assistant principals, we see here that those minimum rates are below the market average, ranging generally from $17,000 to $29,000 a year below the survey average. The maximum rates are somewhat closer to the market average, still below, and ranging from about $6,000 to about $12,000 per year. So still a market gap, but not quite as big as in those starting salaries. So the next three slides show the total compensation comparison for these three groups. The first one focused on those directors, Director of Student Services, Director of Student Activities. Since most school administrators are experienced educators and are paid in the second half of that salary range, we thought it would make sense to look at the maximum rate here. So instead of the midpoint of that range, here we're looking at the maximum rate. So while FCPS's benefit costs are somewhat higher than the survey average, the total compensation costs are still below market because of the differences in those salaries.
Another thing I'd just point out, and I think it's obvious, but I think it just to make sure we're all on the same page. I know board members have asked before with regard to our health care benefits, how much we pay toward the health plan, how comparable are we? This shows you we're pretty comparable on health benefit cost as compared to other surrounding or comparable school systems. You'd see probably the greatest differences are in base salary and in retirement contributions, depending upon position. But this is, I think, informative for us as we look at how do these positions compare in terms of total compensation, right? Where are we putting our money?
Yep. So this chart looks at assistant principals, again, the same total compensation comparison. What we find here is that the total compensation is generally market comparable after including the cost of benefits. And again, we're looking at the top of that range.
I'd be a little careful on saying it's completely comparable because at the end of the day, if all surrounding school systems or most were on a 12-month contract, that increases their take home. I know they work more, but when you had to equate it the same, or we couldn't compare.
Right.
But that's important to point out, though, is 12-month contract versus an 11-month contract.
You're absolutely right. Yes, I think
So we just always have to
right.
keep that in the back of our mind.
Right. That the actual salaries in other school systems for an assistant principal is about 10% higher than this because of that additional, about 9% higher. And this last chart here is for school principals. We had a similar finding that the total compensation is close to the market average, although for the high school principals, total compensation is still somewhat below the market average. So let's talk about other jobs on the unified scale. We had about 90 job titles here that we looked at. They represent jobs from a lot of different job families in the organization, including non-exempt positions and exempt positions. Non-exempt jobs are those jobs that are eligible by law for overtime compensation if they work more than 40 hours per week, and exempt are salaried, professional, managerial positions. In the non-exempt group, we looked at jobs covering food service, transportation, facilities, and administrative and office support. You can see the number of job titles here. In the exempt group, we looked at jobs in healthcare and clinicians, education specialists and management, facilities, transportation, IT, finance and accounting, as well as other business operations. Now, the 90 job titles that we chose for this study represent about 70% of all the covered employees and positions throughout the school system. So we feel confident we have a nice, strong representation of all positions throughout the system. A few important notes regarding these unified scale jobs, because this was the hardest part of this. So I do want to say that the unified scale covers a very wide array of occupations, as you could see from the job families. That means that not all market segments are applicable to all jobs. Some jobs are only found in school districts, some are found in school districts and local governments, some are also found in private sector.
Make a note, because down the road, I think this is a conversation we're going to have, is do we need to split some of these scales up? Because it is very unusual to have this one huge scale for all these varied positions.
Again, I said it earlier, but job matches are almost never exact. I don't want to belabor that point since we do have to get onto the numbers. But also the study compares base pay ranges and benefit costs. I know I've said that too, but I'm going to say it again because the private sector data we have in here is just base pay. And as you know, in the private sector, unlike in the public sector, there are opportunities for bonuses, profit sharing, variable pay that is simply not available in government. So we didn't have a lot of that information, so we're looking at base pay ranges here in all sectors. So to the extent that we talk a little bit about private sector salaries, I would say those are underestimated in terms of the direct compensation that could be available to an employee. And again, the study evaluates the competitiveness of the scheduled pay range and not any individual employee. So I think I'm trying to be very careful in the words that I choose, and I hope that's coming across. But I don't think we can infer from any of this data that any particular employee is either underpaid or overpaid as a result of this analysis, because we are looking at the pay ranges. That's important to keep in mind when we talk about these results. So looking at these line charts, this shows the non-exempt job groups, that is food service, transportation, facilities, and office support. And keeping in mind that these are averages, we have several job titles in each group. But we see here for food service, for example, that average minimum salary of $17,871 is below the market average of $22,462. The maximum of the ranges for food service at roughly $33,500 is also below the survey average of $39,000. Some similar findings for transportation jobs, but then we found in the facilities and warehouse and then administrative and office support, those pay ranges are more market comparable.
Can you describe, just for the benefit of the group, what was included within administrative and office support?
A lot of jobs. Office assistant, administrative assistant, office assistant, administrative assistant, business process.
It was mainly your business operations, the office staff to do your day-to-day functions. So these are your non-exempt positions. So
Important. So don't equate, when you see administrative and office support, don't equate that that's an
professional
administrator.
level office
It's not that.
administrator. It's administrative work within our schools and offices, yes.
Support, yeah, this is support staff, and the one job title I was trying to reach for was the student information assistant. You have a lot of positions in that role, so it's those sorts of positions we're talking about. Now the next group is one of the exempt job groups here. We have the healthcare and clinicians, and those are psychologists, social workers, those sorts of jobs. Then education specialists and management, that includes with managers and directors and coordinators. The third category is facilities and warehouse. And then transportation, and again, I want to emphasize here that these are not the hourly or non-exempt positions in transportation, but the managers and directors and professionals involved in the planning and managing of transportation.
This got so complex because just how many positions are in some of these areas. And we just felt like, for an example, in transportation, if we lumped them all together, it would give you a skewed results. And so we felt like the best way to separate out so you could get a true picture of maybe compensation is pull out the exempt position. So if there's a different way you want to see it down the road, we can show it a different way. But for the purposes of a good general overview of kind of where we felt like it was the best way to show it. So if you want to see a different way, we can, but exempt, non-exempt, and I think all of you know what that means. But we're not lumping together like supervisors in transportation with our bus drivers,
Right.
because that would immediately skew the information and not give us a good picture.
But I think we see a similar pattern in a lot of these. And the pattern that I saw was that the minimum or those starting entry step one rates are a bit below market. But in general, I want to say in general, overall, the maximum rates are more market comparable. Now, that's not true for every single job here, but in general, that's the pattern I saw throughout all of this data. The last group of job family groupings we have is information technology, where we had 10 job titles, finance and accounting, another 10 job titles, and then business operations. Again, the professional, salaried, exempt side of business operations. So we're talking managers, directors, coordinators, those sorts of positions, analysts as well. In a similar pattern, minimum rates, on average, below market. Maximum rates are closer to the market average. So now the bar charts for total compensation, again, starting with the non-exempt job groups. We found that those food service jobs continue to be below the market average, while the other non-exempt job groups are more market competitive when we include the cost of benefits. And here we're looking at the midpoint of that pay range. Similarly, the compensation for these exempt job groups become more market competitive after including the cost of benefits. And this slide, we're looking at the healthcare jobs, education professionals, facilities management, and transportation management.
Heather, if we could we get you to go back and then on the slides where you're using the midpoint, can you just make a note of that? And then which ones you use the maximum? Am I seeing where? Okay, I apologize. It is showing it on there.
The only one we're using the maximum for is the school administrators.
Okay, I apologize. I see it now. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. There's a lot of information on these charts. And then lastly, we found the same sort of pattern for the business operations jobs. That is information technology, finance and accounting, and other business operations, generally at the midpoint of the pay range. After including the cost of benefits, the total compensation is comparable to the market. So summarizing some key findings, for teacher pay rates, we found that those are generally below market, especially during the mid-career years. That's years 5 through 20 of a teacher's career. The instructional assistants, we found the pay rates are generally comparable to the market. The school administrator pay rates are significantly below market at the range minimum, but closer to the market at the maximum. Closer. That's correct. On the unified scale, we found the pay rates are below market at the range minimum for many jobs, but closer to the market. Again, closer to the market at the maximum. Including benefit costs in the calculations generally improves the overall market position mainly because of the contributions associated with your retirement plans. So next steps. We're currently conducting an employee opinion survey around the issues of compensation. It was sent to all employees on February 1st. The survey is designed to ask employees their opinions, preferences, and priorities regarding compensation policies and practices. And I'm pleased to say that there's been a very positive reception so far to the survey. We already have a 38% response rate, and the survey is scheduled to close on the 15th. Again, a 38% response rate. In March, we plan to conduct employee focus groups to understand further what types of compensation programs are likely to be effective in recruiting and retaining highly qualified teachers and staff. That's going to happen in March. And throughout the spring, we'll be using this feedback from employees and the market information to develop some alternative approaches. And by the end of June, we hope to be able to finalize these new approaches and estimate costs. So getting to a topic that we're going to talk about over the next few months and the work sessions over the next, I think, 3 months. Is that what you said?
At least.
At least. Getting to the concept of a compensation philosophy or a compensation strategy. And I'd like to leave you with a few questions and a few thoughts for you to think about between now and the next meeting, including market position. That is, what should be our desired market position? What's our target? I've looked at a market average here. Some organizations want to target 100% of the market average, or they might look at a corridor of, say, 95% to 105% of that average. There are a lot of different approaches.
And another example on that is teachers. You know where we fell on the comparison with teachers? We could say we want to be in the top 5 in the comparisons, right? Or above the average. And y'all know what I'm talking about. That might look different than it does for the other employee scales, just because the teacher piece is so different.
Exactly. Sometimes when we talk about competitiveness with teachers, we think about ranking. What's our ranking compared to the other 7 school districts we're looking at? It doesn't make a lot of sense to look at ranking for 100 other job titles that we've looked at in this survey. It might make a little more sense to have a broader compensation strategy and philosophy around where we would like to be. So in other words, we need to think about what that target market position could be, and thinking about the real goal of being effective to attracting and keeping the kinds of employees we want to have here. So it's not just a number to pick a number, it's thinking about how can that number be used and what's our strategy for attracting and keeping those employees. The second question has to do with differentiated pay. Do we want to think about having different pay approaches for critical needs jobs and hard to fill positions? I think that's particularly complex subject when it comes to teachers. Teachers have been accustomed to all being on the same pay scale and having pay differences based solely on time and not necessarily on the position that they hold. So I think that'll be a discussion that we need to have, is if there are certain positions that are harder to fill than others, how do we approach perhaps having a different recruitment and retention strategy for those positions? And is that something that's desirable?
And you're developing, or we'll come up with, we will have draft ideas, recommendations for you. I think you're bringing some of those forward. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
At a later conversation.
Yep. And then the third topic is around the salary scales. I've talked about the 3 scales that you have now: teacher scale, instructional assistants, and the unified scale. And I think it's worth talking about whether that's how you want to continue. Does it make sense to have those 3 in the way that they're divided up? And what are the implications for that? Sometimes the market moves a little differently for some jobs than others, or sometimes you might want a different approach towards salary administration and compensation for one type of group versus another. So it sounds like a simple question, but then it gets a little deeper into thinking about how do we want to pay employees in different types of categories.
So market position, I think some of that's been answered here. How do we compare to other surrounding jurisdictions with regard to our other positions? I think we can have those conversations with great ease. I think probably with our do we want a unified scale? Do we want to split up our scales? I think that is a conversation we can help facilitate in the coming months. Probably the hardest one for us to tackle is how do we want to reshape our teacher scales? And so we will be preparing for you all some ideas, some ways that we can approach that in the coming months. But just kind of to plant the seed, you'll remember, and we put it back in here again, we have 6 lanes in our teacher scale. We also know that with regard to the market, that's where we're the least competitive, it looks like. Certainly there's some places and other places that we need to address, but from a large kind of macro level, so we're going to have to redo our teacher scales, maybe tweak some of the others, but I think our teacher scale is probably the one that's going to have to take the most. So we'll have an opportunity to talk about how we want that to look and where do we want to be the most competitive. I think we've seen some examples of some surrounding jurisdictions that were more on a J curve. They emphasized, they put more money up front, and it kind of leveled off earlier than what ours did. And we'll have some examples and some ways to look at that. And we may no longer want 6 lanes. That's very unusual to have 6 lanes. Typically teacher scales will have 3 or 4 lanes. Is that correct? And then we'll also have to talk about people start getting really nervous when we start changing salary schedules and scales. So at some point we'll have to talk about, what do we need to say about that up front to put people's minds at ease? And I've done this in other places too, and I certainly would not want to, You're the people that make the important decisions. We're here to support those decisions. But at some point, you may want to think about, do we want to commit to people that no one will make less than what they're currently making as we start talking about, are we going to take money away from anyone? What I've done in other situations is we will do no harm. So as we move scales around, there may be people that will be frozen, but no one will be hurt. That our goal is to move everybody up, right? To have a healthier system. And then finally, I felt like it's important to point out, this is a point in time. As others surrounding, I think this is obvious, but it's important to state that as other school systems are starting to adopt budgets and move forward into the next year, they'll make decisions around compensation that will change a lot of this in the marketplace. So we always have to pay attention to what surrounding jurisdictions are doing as well, because that changes the picture. But it does represent a point in time. I think we're ready for questions. Is that right? Ready for questions?
And I realize I've compressed a 90-minute presentation into about 40 minutes. So I'm hoping we covered all the points we needed to, but I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you. Likewise, school board members will compress your questions into so that we can be all done by 7 o'clock. Okay, thank you. I have 5 board members on my list. Before I go to Mr. Church, let me ask you a couple of questions to start with. Retirement benefits, so we are a little more generous than the comparison school districts or other government entities. Is that generally what the data show?
We found that your costs are higher.
Costs are higher. Okay, all right. Is that
Mr. Moon, that's because of our ERFC.
I was going to ask whether it is structurally that way or is it voluntarily on our part, whether we have a flexibility, discretion to do otherwise, or we are fixed.
For most of your employees, you have 2 retirement plans. The VRS, Virginia Retirement System, which
we have no control over.
You don't have any control over that. You choose to be a part of that. And then there's also the supplemental defined benefit pension plan. We did find some other supplemental retirement plans and other organizations that we looked at, but many of those are defined contribution plans where there is a little more flexibility from year to year as to how much that organization wants to contribute to that. By design, that kind of plan has more flexibility. With a defined benefit pension plan, the contribution you need to make to fund future benefits is set in an actuarial method that tends to not change very much from year to year.
Okay,
It's important. It's important. This conversation, as I said, will continue over the coming months. ERFC has hired an actuary to present a report and to evaluate the plan, to look at options that this board may have. You know, are there going to be design changes in the future? So that work is being done and will be presented to the board in April. So you will have a comprehensive analysis and report on ERFC plan moving forward.
okay. The next question that I have is, when you see the scale from minimum to the maximum, does it make sense to look at the amount of time it takes for an employee in a certain position to reach the top from the minimum? For example, it might take 20 years for a certain position in our school system versus another school district or government.
That's an interesting question because we were able to do that with teachers because we looked at that career earnings analysis. We're not able to do that with the unified scale positions for many reasons. The first reason is that some of the organizations that we surveyed do not have a step plan in the same way that you do. There's more of an open range without steps in between. So it's impossible to know what pay progression somebody would have in such a system, whereas you may be able to estimate it in a step plan. The second reason is because many of the, particularly the professional and managerial positions on the unified scale, have fairly high minimum requirements. So you're hiring in people with significant experience, and it's not typical for them to start at step one of that pay range. So whereas we could make assumptions about teachers to say you have a new teacher right out of school, you hire them, they're likely to be at step one and progress through their career, you can't say the same thing for an accounting manager or a school principal for that matter. It doesn't tend to lend itself to that. The federal government, that might be a little bit different. I think that's a scale that a lot of people are familiar with. So we can make some guesses as to how somebody would move through a scale if they started at step one and went up to the maximum, but it would be just a guess.
That I have Mr. Schultz, Mrs. Strauss, to be followed by Ms. Hines, Mrs. McLaughlin, and Mrs. Hoff and Karen Colbert-Sanders. Mr. Schultz.
So it may have taken to the last agenda item of the day, but this time I wrote down the slides. Can you please go to slide 19? Okay. And then the slide that we were on just before that, I first want to look at this one. So you're telling us for this particular slice of our employee base that you moved this combined salary plus benefits to the maximum base salary. And then can you go to the other one that was just the little bar? This one. Is this one that is up there based on maximum, or are you talking about you just took the top dollar value for each one of those positions?
Correct. This one is a range. So this gives you minimum to the maximum. But when we compare the total compensation, we went ahead and used the maximum salary to be able to compare the total compensation for that particular position. But this gives you the range of the salary lane for that particular position.
We
So-
could have picked different places. Mhm.
So analytically, again, the problem that I have with this is I don't know what the distribution of employees is across that bar. Are 80% of the employees at the maximum? Are 2% at the maximum? Usually you have a midpoint, and there is no midpoint here, so I don't understand what the distribution is. This is not, I
Yeah.
hate to say it, but this is not particularly a great chart.
Well, again, we're looking at the pay range.
I
At this
understand you're looking at the
scheduled
pay
range.
range, but if we have 2,000 employees on that page, I don't understand if, let's just say 500, 500, and 1,000, or 500, 500, 500. Let's just say 1,500. There's 500 in each one of those categories. What is the distribution across that range? Are the bulk of the employees evenly distributed? Are the bulk of the employees at the midpoint? Or the bulk of, so this is not.
Answer your question. School administrators, most of them are in the second half of the salary range. That is after the midpoint. That is
Well,
one of the reasons why we chose the maximum pay rate, which again is the most that a school administrator would be paid.
I understand most, but you are making a qualitative statement when I want a quantitative statement. I would like to know across there how many employees we're talking about, what's the data that's associated, so that I understand.
So let me do this. Is that something you can provide us?
So the reason I ask, can we go back over to the other one, slide 19 or 20, it doesn't matter. The reason I ask is I don't know, when I'm looking at these employee categories, where the problem lies in terms of where do we need to be pushing? Do we leave the maximum where it is and just push the minimum up? And if I don't have an understanding of the distribution of employees across those categories, that's an issue. I also have an issue that in the exact same presentation, on this particular set of slides, the same color category, the same slide, the same bar chart, you use maximum here and minimum on the other. I understand that, but in the second set of employee categories, we now all of a sudden drop to mid and that to me is a presentation issue, in that you create an inability for a discernment on data.
Okay, this is an important point that we've got to discuss right now, because to clarify, we can certainly change all of these to midpoint or to maximum. We can do that. The ranges tell you where we are, but we can switch that if that's the case. Now, if we go back in and look at distribution of current employees, that's a different kind of analysis. We're saying, how do we compare to the marketplace? If you go back and you look, where does everyone fall out on this? Then you're looking at, really it's a comparison of, do we have more tenured principals than surrounding jurisdictions? Then you're looking at tenure, and it sometimes can skew. Do I have to, you see what I'm saying? You don't get a good analysis. That's why compensation studies look at your scales, not at what you're currently paying people. It's two different issues. Thank you.
Okay, let's see whether,
And that's important distinction.
okay,
How about I make the
Mr.
distinction
Schultz
that I'm
has
looking for?
a table.
The distinction that I'm looking
Flo.
for is, out of how many employees, is it 2%, 10%, whatever, in each of the categories where we have a pressure point? And I think that is a reasonable data point of discernment for us to understand. That's how you quantify a problem.
What is a pressure point quantitatively?
This is not
You've
going
asked
well. I'm not at the solution. On the previous slide, when you have the range, if you have, the range just shows the person who holds that title who's paid the least and the person who holds that title that's paid the most. The question is,
that's not it. It's the scheduled range. Again, think about if this is the first day of Fairfax County Public Schools and you have no employees, but you've decided to set these salary scales to say, we've thought that we're going to pay assistant principals from X to Y. Those are the salary scales. I understand your question about where employees are on those scales,
But
but
it's
that
my
tells
question.
you.
I'm the one that's asking the question, which is, I understand what you're trying to tell me. I'm saying that across that salary scale, how many of our employees fall at the top
Okay.
end, the
Let's
middle,
do
or the
this.
bottom
Let's
end?
do this. Is the data available for board members to have, the distribution of our employees on those scale? And if the data is available, could you
How
provide us?
hard is that, Susan? Because that's completely different analysis. How hard is that for you all to do? Well, no. Before we promise that we're going to do something, I want to make
So
sure that
I
we can do
just want to
it.
see whether data is available, whether data can be provided.
Data is available, and we could do it in the quartiles. We are starting to look at that data to see where employees are, but the whole, to I think Dr. Garza's point and Heather's point, the whole study is really looking at the salary range. So we do understand within that salary range, if we have a very tenured principal, they're going to be at the top end of the scale. So we can provide you with that distribution. So at the end of the day, when we have the new compensation scale philosophy ranges, it's going to show that if we have a lower minimum and we have to move that minimum up just to compress, and let's just say the top end of the scale is.
With what you're doing right now, though, let me explain to you the difference. If that salary range is, if we have a minimum on our salary range and a maximum, and 90% of our salary, of our employees who hold that title are within the top 10 or 15% of that maximum, we have a majorly different problem, because the bottom of that salary range becomes irrelevant. That needs to move dramatically up if a majority are at the top. And that's why the distribution, a quartile, even a midpoint, an analysis of the midpoint on there would tell us, is the bottom of the range less
That's
or more?
correct. That's correct. But that's also point in time. 5 years from now, we could have 80% of our employees on the 50th percentile of that salary range. It's how employees come into those positions and progress
Ms.
through the
Clinton.
salary
Ms. Clinton,
rates.
let's
I
do
got
this.
it. I got it.
Let's-
And on another note, Dr. Garza, you intimated at it, and I'm wondering on the question of the 6 ranges of how differentiated our scale is. 6 lanes, thank you. Can we not I know this is a big question and maybe it's been contemplated. Is there not a way for everybody other than, a director of student activities for high school, for all the other employees to work with the Board of Supervisors and come up with, if you will, a unified scale across the county of a range so we stop the bickering with the Board of Supervisors on how much they're going to pay and how much we're going to pay? It's a Fairfax County employee X. And granted, the educators would have to be like in a different lane or range or whatever. But for anybody that does a county type of service that could provide it to parks or any place else, if we could create a comparative salary scale with them, and I just think a big thing, especially
I
if
do
people
think it's
move back and
possible.
forth.
I don't know that you want to do it, but I do think it's possible. And I do think it was done at one time, and it was consciously split at one time. And board members that were on the board for a while, I know that. But is it possible? Yes, I think so.
Okay, are you done, Mr. Church? Okay, I have Mr. Strauss and Ms. Hines.
Thank you. I appreciate this, all very interesting. And again, just to recap, I think all of our employees, a certain percent of our employees are on the supplemental county retirement system. And as just the next question, I would like to know which of the categories are, you don't have to tell me that right now. Right, and we, as the school board, we have no control over the county side, but I know when we have done other comparable studies between contribution rates between ERFC and the county, that does make a difference as to how that is set up. It has been a while since we have done a true study like this, but we've done them before, and we've done them, and when we have, there's always has to be the guarantee that nobody loses. That is a critical piece, and the plus and the minus of tying ourselves to a county agreement with pay. It's great when you have enough money and you're all agreeing to give nice raises to everybody across the board. When times are tight and we are desperately trying to save positions directly in a classroom, if you are too tightly held to the county, then we cannot necessarily differentiate what we're going to do. And that's so you always have to think of that. They have greater control over the purse strings and what they're going to do on their side. When times are tough, we need as much flexibility as possible to do what we have to do for our classrooms. So that's both sides of it. And I have to go to a PTA meeting.
Besides, Mrs. McLaughlin.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you. This is very helpful. I would mention, I have heard certain supervisors mention that they do kind of a corridor study, I think is what they call it, which is this kind of what we're talking about, where they take certain types of jobs and they look at them differently. They don't have one scale. And I think that's what we're kind of doing here. So my feeling is, from those I've talked to, supervisors I've talked to, and it's not many about this, but I think they would like to see us do this. I don't know that we necessarily need to join them and join our groups, but just I think it would probably help them feel more confident about how we do pay to see us do this. So I think just doing it is probably helping along those lines. Just I'd throw that out there. So on slide 17, and I think we talked about this, but I want to make sure that I'm clear. When we took the assistant principals, and you said that in other districts they are actually 12-month employees. So that means that you have to add a month's salary to the scale to the market average, right? Or because we cut them down to 11 months, meaning that their annual salary is higher than this.
Correct.
Okay, all right, thanks. So it's even worse than it looks, right? Actually, if you think about someone is looking at their annual salary, not their monthly. Yeah, right. Okay, slide 19 and others like it, where we show the mix of salary and benefits. And I know that this is just kind of illustrative, because obviously all throughout there we have different, but it helps us to see that we do have very rich retirement benefits, relatively speaking. And I think some people may look at this and make a value judgment that, well, we're spending too much on retirement and not enough on base pay. But really, I don't think we can make that value judgment without our employees participating in it, and I'm sure that's part of the survey. Okay. And then just one more question. With the $40 million that we're asking for in FY 2017, and it may be hard to talk about this now, but I assume I just want to make sure I understand that the idea of that $40 million is to take what we learned from here and be able to make some changes. But we can make some changes. Maybe you want to speak to that.
Teacher scale. For the teacher scale, yes,
Teacher
ma'am.
scale, okay.
And over the coming months, we actually have planned, we'll be bringing you some options, assuming that $40 million is intact at the end of the process, what choices we think the board might want to consider with different ways of using the $40 million. It does give us an opportunity to start to create a different scale.
Thank you. Mrs. McLaughlin, to be followed by Karen Grover-Sanders.
Okay. First of all, I want to say that these bar graphs that we do, and it's the chart behind you, where we're showing total compensation, in my mind, is the most impactful for us for a real kind of clear and easy understanding at first blush. I mean, obviously, there's so much to delve underneath it. I am still a little unclear about why we used the maximum for the DSSs and DSAs, the assistant principals and principals, but then for the other jobs, and I think I heard you say it's because most of them were toward the max anyway, so you just wanted us to know that in terms of your system.
But we can go in and add that.
I just think
We can go back and add.
from an apples to apples standpoint, it might be helpful since we'd run them at midpoint just to kind of see midpoint as well.
Sure.
My biggest request is that looking at this graph where it's for the teachers' total compensation, is there a reason that we don't have a comparable one like this? Because
But that's what we said at the very beginning. We can't compare in the same way. The scales are so different. So you want to explain that further? I said it, maybe I didn't explain it well, and that's why no one
and
caught it.
no, let me see if I can help before we go off on a rabbit hole that I don't want to be in. This still shows you midpoint where somebody is in their career. I mean, you have this data that says, between, in a 30-year career, so even if you wanted to do starting point, midpoint, maximum point, or if you went to
You are asking the bar chart of the teacher salaries. To
total
look- yes.
compensation,
Yes, and we could
Because-
do that at midpoint for teachers.
right. And you could even, if you wanted to,
Okay.
I want this turned into this.
So
I want. Yes, that's
does- so-
exactly. That's what I was saying. If you picked starting, where we tend to be similar to the market average, and then toward the latter part, we get better, again, based on this, and it's the midpoint where we suffer. I think it also helps our everyone in the county understand where are we getting hit the hardest. So, because as Dr. Garza knows, I think we have a responsibility to be helping all of our employees understand that for teacher compensation, we are, again, so benefits rich that almost in no other category is it so evident where you look at pay and it is so much worse than when you take into the compensation component. And then again, at what point are they in their career when it's at its most difficult? Dr. Garza, I really appreciate how you keep helping us understand that we have these 6 salary lanes, and this chart of when we start to make it so teachers are going to finally become competitive and have a competitive wage for the work they do. So an Arlington type model in terms of by year 10, I mean, as I know Ms. Hines can speak to, and any other person at the table who's been teaching in a classroom, I mean, 10 years, you're a veteran. You survived to 10 years, and why are we making you wait till 22 to suddenly be able to comfortably or more better to pay your bills? And so I want to encourage our teachers between year 5 and 8, when we seem to lose them, it's because they're still languishing and waiting a really long time before they'll see something get better. And now to the question about the assistant principals, and I appreciate what Ms. Hines was saying and others, keep in mind, you're right. I mean, if we want to be competitive for our assistant principals and they can go next door, and yes, it's a 12-month salary versus 11, so then their annual take-home looks a lot better. But if we're worried about that we're losing assistant principals, we can't turn around and just give them a 12-month salary for 11 months worth of work. We then say, you know what? We know we have a stripped down, very lean central administration. So if we want to be competitive and we want to give them 12-month salaries again so we don't lose them to the other districts, then you're back on to a 12-month. You don't get an 11-month contract with a 12-month compensation. But because I'm thinking all the great, analysis and stuff. Good point. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And so, one last thing I think this was hopefully talked to in the prior presentation. As I recall off the top of my head, Arlington has a longer total days in their teacher contracts than we do. Like, I remember, I think the Fairfax County total days of their contract length was 195 days, something like that. But Arlington used to be, at least I remember when I joined the board 4 years ago, they have like 5 more days into their contract. So were we adjusting for that when we did the market comparisons?
For the teachers, we did look at contract days
Okay.
throughout all the different school systems. And what we saw with Arlington is while they advertise 200 contract days, 6 of those days are unscheduled.
Which
So
means
that-
what?
I'm not entirely certain. So what I'm saying is when you take out those 6 days, it equals the same number of contract days at Fairfax County. They're not
Right,
working
no, I
those
understand,
days. So they're unscheduled paid days, meaning if
so
they're
do we
asked-
call Arlington and say, does unscheduled mean they don't have to work from home, they don't have to do anything?
That's correct. So I believe they count days that the teachers do not have to work, and they call it paid non-working days. Whereas when we say 194 contract days, it's literally 194 days of work.
And it's interesting about that because I got an email from someone who was irate about teacher compensation and saying, something to the degree of, these teachers already get paid summers off. And of course, I thought was great. Another long email. I got to get prepared to explain that no, as you've just described, 100 and what was it was again 94? Yeah, I mean, 194 days is 194 days working. If we were to do 6 unscheduled days, in my mind, that would be hopefully making up for the fact that there's all these paid holidays that happen during a school calendar here, and they're not technically getting paid for those days. They're just not in school and not having to work it.
Have paid holidays for anyone.
That's a conversation for another day.
It's true. You have to take a vacation day for.
Okay, let's have that conversation on a different day.
Can we bring those forward in a future? I think it would be good for us to see those again. How many, as we do this work, how many days are in teacher contracts surrounding us? I think that'd be good to have at our fingertips. Some of those days, I would imagine, may have something to do with professional development. They expect teachers to take advantage of maybe during the summer or something like that. So let's look at those differences.
Yeah. So the final point is, so I'm glad you're telling me we can get something like this for the teachers. I think that's essential. And then, the only other thing, Dr. Garza, in terms of being strategic with our time, is I think that from what Heather has presented now to all of us, again, where we are most challenged is with our teacher compensation when you look at all of our employees. And now the question is going to be the engagement component with helping everyone understand, do you want to have a more salaried position and depending on where you are in your career, do you like the generous benefits, that Fairfax County offers? Because in the end, we're talking about total compensation. That's how we're going to be able to, attract and retain. But it might be if we're so benefits rich for our younger employees, we're not going to attract them because they want to see the stronger salary.
And I would think the differentiation we have to make there is our health benefit costs are pretty comparable. Mm-hmm. So the real differentiator is our retirement contributions
salary
that
versus
we need to look at.
Mm-hmm.
We need to look at,
mm-hmm.
and that's scheduled. So
right. And then I know, Dr. Garza, you talked about the word you used was, do no harm as we try to do some of these adjusting. I think it would be very helpful for the board when we start to move into that phase that we might have some school divisions where some of that, I know you mentioned you experienced it, but we need to really know what that looks like and, what's the best approach, because obviously we don't want to do any harm, but we also have to figure out how do we finally bring our other employees to competitive rates, and you got to find the money somewhere.
And this is something we can talk about in the coming months, but most systems that I'm familiar with, and Heather, you can probably speak to this, as we start to move the puzzle pieces and it makes people very nervous, sometimes just saying that we will do no harm, it doesn't mean there won't be employees that will potentially be frozen.
Correct.
Until the scale catches
until
up.
they catches up where they are.
The scale catches up to them.
Yeah.
But no one will lose money.
Correct. And I completely understand that.
That's a decision that the board will be able to talk about at a
and
later
the
date.
whole grandfathering thing, people really care about that. Thank you.
Okay, I have Karen Gruber Sanders to be followed by Mrs. Hoff.
Thank you. I just have two very quick questions. Where on the pay scale, when you look at your public health attendants, how many of them are actually below a living wage? Because it's my understanding that there are a number of public health attendants that have to have multiple jobs to They're not below the living wage?
I don't believe they are below living wage, because when we included the living wage adjustment in our budget, those positions did not,
So they're just slightly above it or so?
Yes.
So, okay. And secondly, where do our parent liaisons fit in this picture?
Parent liaisons we did look at in this study. They're not included in these charts for two reasons. One is because they're not on the salary scale. There's a flat hourly rate for those positions, and also they're not benefited employees. So looking at the total compensation, those benefit costs don't apply.
They do receive health care
healthcare.
benefits.
I apologize.
That's okay. I just want to be clear, but they don't receive the retirement benefits and all of that.
Okay.
Correct, Susan?
And then finally, I think the whole concept of do no harm and possibly freezing categories, I think that's where the understanding of the breakout of how many employees are at the various ranges will be important to see.
I agree.
Okay, Mrs. Hoff.
So I just wanted to see if it was possible. I know that in all of your data gathering, you included county positions. And so just for benefit of conversation, would it be possible for us to have the data where we compare jobs that we have in the school system and in the county? I think it would just inform conversation, whether it was something we wanted to talk about, getting together with the county, whether we just wanted to see how we're doing in comparisons to the county, so that when we do talk about budget, I think it's just informative.
That's something we should be able to provide.
Okay, any other board member? If not, we'll go to next steps. Do you have any next steps other than providing that distribution of employees on the scale? Okay, with that, this meeting is adjourned.